I'll try and limit my jokes to the qualitative to some extent. Okay. Excuse me, someone would focus. Last year I had 2 pictures, now I only have 1. So this is the only picture that I have in my presentation. So, yes, this is an introduction to quantitative methodology. As you've just been introduced to the various paradigms, quantitative methodology is more positivistic in its approach, and the qualitative methodology is more, well, anti-positivistic in its approach. So when you try and view it like this, the qualitative tries to figure out how the fly feels while he or she is in the soup, and actually wanting to be in the soup with the fly. But for the positivists, we would rather try and view it from a distance, and there's a particular reason why we would like to view it from a distance, because in our worldview, in the quantitative worldview, we would like to try and be as objective as possible. It's not to say that qualitative is automatically subjective or less objective, but in quantitative methodology there are a lot of things that we try and do and minimize the impact of the researcher's view about things. Hence, we try and quantify and operationalize most of the things. Okay. So my apologies, only picture, no formulas by the way, but I'll gladly share formulas with you. Okay. So when you think about quantitative methodology and you want to try and figure out whether or not this is appropriate for your research, maybe just first the sermon bit. I am a firm believer that you don't choose your methodology and then your research problem. Your research problem dictates which methodology or approach you should use. And how do you know that? If you conduct your literature review, you will see what other researchers did in terms of trying to solve that problem, and that should give you an indication as to the, let's say, predominant theme in terms of approach, in terms of methodology. So if you are unsure, read your journal articles, identify your research problem, and as you later see, depending on your the purpose of your research, then it's highly likely that quantitative may be one approach to provide you with answers. But it's not useful to say, I'm qualitative and I will try and solve this problem by qualitative means. Same as with me, I can't say I'm quantitative and will try and solve everything with quantitative means. I play both sides of the fence. So, when you think about your quantitative research project, here are the main things that we focus on in any quantitative project, and to some extent we will cover this during our session today. So, in general, you will have to focus on conceptualization. So in quantitative methodology, I'll try and speak to the right-hand side. So conceptualization is all about how do you define your variables. Now in quantitative methodology, we mainly focus on 2 variables, or 2 broad categories of variables: your dependent variable and your independent variable, cause and effect. So you need to have a clear definition, understanding of what do you mean by your constructs. So the first part of any quantitative study is to define the variables in terms of the theory that you're using. And that's the whole idea behind conceptualization. And you will see that without a clear definition of your variables, dependent and independent, you will not be able to measure them, to quantify it, or to put it in operation. So conceptualization is all about defining your variables. Just another bit of information. If you're writing your thesis or your dissertation, usually the definition that you will use for your study will also be associated with the measuring instrument that you are using, more often than not. So the definition that you will say that for the purpose of this study, we will use this definition of whatever, it's highly likely that you will use that person's measuring instrument as well. Okay. So conceptualization, definitions, then you choose your research method. So given that this is more quantitative in nature, you will see that yes, you can follow different approaches, and we will go from true experimental research design through to quasi-experimental research design. I've got a joke about quasi, by the way, and non-experimental research designs. Okay. So once you've defined and chosen your approach, then you need to focus on operationalization. So in a quantitative study, operationalization means that how am I going to measure my dependent variable and how am I going to measure my independent variable. So operationalization is how do I put into practice the definition of my dependent variable, and how do I put into practice my definition of my independent variable. And usually then we focus on questionnaires, which can be part of a larger survey. Then you choose your population and sample, and for quantitative methodology we have different approaches to select the sample. And I will touch to some extent on different approaches of choosing your sample, but let's go one step back. So depending on what it is you are interested in solving, what is your research problem, you need to find people that will be able to provide you with answers to your research problem. And that's why you need to be careful in terms of how do you choose your population and how do you choose your sample. For those of you that, for some example, may be looking at whether or not different groups, let's say for example, in terms of qualifications, whatever the case may be, make sure that the people that you are giving the questionnaires to will understand what you mean by the questions being posed. For example, last week I sat with someone regarding a stress questionnaire, and given the fact that this stress questionnaire will be completed by different levels of employees, we have to change some of the wording of the questions to make sure that both, let's say for example, low-level employees in terms of their literacy levels will be able to understand it, as well as those that are higher up in the organization. Another example with the students, even though they are intelligent, some of the terms being used in the questionnaire that we are thinking about may be a bit too technical for them. So we have to change the wording. Okay. So population and sample deals with, will you get enough people, or will you get the right people to provide you with answers to your research problem? But then one thing that in quantitative methodology is sort of like, we like to get larger samples, the extent to which you can generalize your findings. Okay. Bear in mind it's the ultimate, but it's not always possible. Okay. That's one of the differences when you look at sampling from a qualitative perspective. The issue in qualitative research is not to get a representative sample, and the purpose of qualitative research is not necessarily to generalize your findings to other situations or other environments. For quantitative, that's sort of like one of the focus areas. Okay. So you collect your data, and that's usually on the basis of the measuring instruments or your questionnaires that you've chosen, usually in line with your definition. Then once you've collected your data by means of your questionnaires on the appropriate sample, then you do the data analysis or data processing. And during the course of this year I will present some modules on how do you do different kinds of data analysis that you've collected, and then you go back to your research problem and say, well, this is the result. Does it help me answer my research problem? Or can I confirm or accept or reject my hypothesis? Okay. So in a nutshell, this is what we have in any quantitative study. Starting with definitions, looking at the methodology, key component operationalization in terms of standardized questionnaires, choosing a sample, collecting the data and analyzing it by means of various statistical techniques. So this is what I will be trying to cover during the rest of this afternoon. Not the rest of this afternoon. Okay, so I'll take you through the logic of scientific inquiry from a quantitative perspective. Then what you are most probably here for, looking at the different research questions. Taking you through the process of data collection, spending some time on survey research and just giving you a lick and a promise in terms of experimental research designs. Then taking you through the process of data analysis and linking your research question with your research design with your data analysis, which can be fairly useful. So most research studies, be it quantitative and qualitative, will follow this framework. So you've got a research problem or a research question. This research question must be unpacked, solved by means of a particular research design. That research design should give you empirical evidence as to the existence or the frequency with which something exists, and then you draw conclusions on the basis of your evidence. So comparing your problem, your question with your evidence will influence what kind of conclusions you can draw. And that's why we sometimes say that there's partial support for a hypothesis, there's no support for a hypothesis, or we can accept an hypothesis. Quick question, what's the definition of a hypothesis? Ja, so this is stelling. So, stelling. Okay. So, when you think about the hypothesis, it is an untested answer to the question. So, it is definitely a statement that you are going to investigate whether or not this statement seems to be an acceptable answer to my research question. How do you get to that untested answer? Reading your literature. In the literature, you use your theory to build your argument to say, well, what seems to be a plausible answer to this problem? And then you test it and try and confirm it. So most research starts with a research problem. This is what you will see in the next few slides. We've got different kinds of research questions that you may want to investigate, and depending on the type of question, I'll show you what design is more appropriate and which techniques to analyze the data. So, most of you should know this. Good research problem will tell you what is the purpose or the aim of a particular study. Okay, so up until now, there's not much difference between us and quality. Okay? So there can only be one right answer. So the jokes will come in now. Okay, so your research problem should be clear. So when you read it, one should be able to say, well, okay, I've got some idea of what is the aim or the purpose of your study. To some extent, one can already figure out the variables that you're going to focus on in your study, what's your dependent variable and independent variable. So on the basis of your research problem, then derive your research hypotheses. your hypotheses and your research problem. Now have to figure out, so what will be the best way to answer this research question? So in general, when we think about research questions, I like to put it in terms of the 4 aims of research. Most research tries to describe something, or it tries to explain something. Research can also try and predict something. And research may also have the aim of intervention. So when you think about your research question or your problem statement will either be in the form of describing something. Don't worry, I'll give you examples now. Or your research problem may focus on explaining something. Or your research problem may try and predict something that will happen. Or if you are very optimistic, you can have a research problem that tries to measure the impact of something. And that's when we get to intervention. So your research problem, the description, explanation, prediction, and intervention, will require a particular research design as well as appropriate data analysis techniques. So we've got research designs that are more appropriate for description. We've got research designs that are more appropriate for explanation. We've got research designs that are more appropriate for prediction and intervention. Yes?
Wants to identify, is that seen synonymously with this description?
So it all depends on identifying what. So let me give you an example. So I can, let's say, allow myself to introduce myself. Okay, here's an example. You may want to identify the characteristics associated with what's your field of study? Sorry, let me ask you this. Die naast wat ek daarom kom is industrial psychology. Let's say, for example, don't you guys also work with manual dexterity? So let's say, for example, you want to identify the characteristics associated with those individuals that have gone through a particular sort of like intervention to regain the dexterity in their hands. Okay. So depending on how far you want to go, you can identify, describe the characteristics associated with those that seem to be successful in using their hands again. But if you want to move further than just identifying what they look like, you want to say, well, under which circumstances do these people seem to be performing better, then you move from description to prediction. But usually we start off by identifying basic characteristics. That's, you will see that there's a difference between the description of qualitative research versus the description of quantitative research. But depending on how far you want to go, we can use it as well. Yeah. So, I had to be very specific in saying that if you've got a research question that is exploratory in nature, it is predominantly qualitative. So when you have an exploratory question, it usually is something related to a very new field of interest. Now, in a quantitative perspective, I usually tell students or people that want to conduct research, the moment when you see that you don't have enough theory or literature on a particular topic, then you're in for a rough ride. I did not say that.
I did.
Okay. So yes, but if there's very little on your particular research topic, meaning there's no definition of your dependent variable, very little information on your independent variable, then you need to do the groundwork. That's why a lot of mixed methods look great. If you look at mixed methods research design, there's one that is called the exploratory sequential design, where you start with qualitative research, meaning literally exploring the constructs that you want to measure, and one variant of that is then to design or develop a questionnaire. So you use your qualitative information to define the constructs, to measure it, then put it into a quantitative design. So it is possible to use that variant, the exploratory sequential design, first qualitative, then quantitative. But if there's very little information on it, go in exploratory. Yes, there's nothing wrong with satisfying your curiosity. That's purely exploratory. You can go for qualitative research to determine the feasibility of undertaking an extensive study. It's almost like a pilot. Not a pilot, a pilot. You'll see I've got a very dark skin. Okay. Also, to identify the concepts, a PhD student that I'm assisting now, he used the qualitative approach in his, well, initially qualitative, to identify in his study, did they have a good enough coverage of the constructs that he wanted to test in his model. So they conducted qualitative interviews, looked at the themes that emerged from that particular study, compared those themes with the variables that he's testing in his, what we call a structural model. Okay, so you can do that. Yes, exploratory is fine for future research or to develop new hypotheses. But exploration is just that. Okay. Now we get to something more useful. If you've got a descriptive study, then this is what you would like to do. So this is all like your identification. So you describe something in depth. You describe in depth, let's say for example, both psychological and physiological characteristics of individuals that have regained the dexterity in their hands. That's fine. You describe it in detail. Usually we describe it, in terms of frequencies, meaning how much, how often does this particular thing occur, and it can either be from a qualitative perspective, a narrative, discourse analysis, or you can use more structured statistical techniques to describe something, usually in terms of correlations, etc. So a descriptive study then deals with, well, this percentage of females have got this particular view. The majority of the sample seems to feel that this is happening. There seems to be a relation between this and that. We describe it. You can also have research questions that focus on explanation and prediction. So now you actually ask the question, well, why is there a relationship between something? So description is just to say there is a relationship. With explanatory research, you would like to go one step further and say, but we've observed this relationship. What is the reason for it? How do I explain it? Why is it happening? Now, very important, although in the literature they talk about causal models and causality, please just remember the following. It is impossible to infer cause and effect relationships if you are not using true experimental research design. So don't use the word this thing causes that if you did not use true experimental research design. And I'll explain that in a minute. The best that we can do in the explanation in prediction is to say something like the following. It is highly likely that this variable preceded the other one. It seems possible that this variable may influence that. But no cause and effect. So before we get there, let me ask you. So what can you tell me about a true experimental research design? What are its characteristics? Don't worry, I'll explain this. Okay, so when you think about experimental research designs, and I'll go into these a little bit later, the major characteristics are the following. There's usually random assignment of individuals either to a control group or to an experimental group. The control group, they do not get exposure to your intervention. The experimental group, they get exposure to your intervention. Also important part of a true experimental research design, there's a pre-test and post-test involved. You need to have the pre-test post-test to see did change occur from before the intervention to after the intervention. So just bear that in mind. So when we think about causality, the issue is about necessary versus sufficient. So I'm not going to go into detail there, but sometimes a variable seems to be there when that outcome is occurring, but it's not always the case. Then we say that is sufficient. But necessary means that, here's an example. To freeze means that you must be below zero. Okay. It is necessary. Okay, so, but that's not something that you need to worry about in our stuff in quantitative, because we don't always get true experimental research designs. But it's a useful exercise. Okay. So when we think about causality, for those of you that want to go for true experimental research designs, three things must be met. First of all, the cause must precede the effect in time. Okay, so it's first the intervention, then an observable change. For those of you that think I'm speaking Greek, you're absolutely right. That's the Greek symbol xi, and that's the Greek symbol eta. Try and think of it like this. Cause is xi, effect is eta. Okay, both of them is C and E. But okay. So cause must precede the effect in time. They must be correlated. So you can't say this thing causes something else if there's no statistical correlation between them. And this correlation cannot be explained by rival hypotheses. Okay. If you ask me nicely, I'll explain some of those rival hypotheses later. But for now, let's stick to that. Yep. So when we think about a predictor, you're not necessarily going to say, well, this is the only cause for what we are observing. A predictor is just something to say, well, okay, it seems to be influencing something else. Now we can determine the strength of that influence. Or how much in technical terms, when we say this is a predictor, you would like to know what proportion of the variance, meaning